Okay. So this is actually, in a way, it's actually kind of part 3. But really, in terms of focus on U.S. foreign policy, it's part 2 of this U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East series. If you haven't watched it yet, I highly recommend the Frontline episode that just came out called Losing Iraq. And because that exists, I am going to actually not talk all that much about the war in Iraq. I am going to talk about it, but I'm going to leave a lot of the detail out. And I might overlap a little bit with it, but my goal isn't to go into that detail because I just assume you went and watched that and got the detail there. So what I'm going to try and do instead is get us the politics as opposed to the execution of the war, and then maybe see if I can't make why we do Iraq and then why we end up in the situation we're in now make sense, even though it's completely nonsensical. So let me start in '58. In the last week, what I did was I talked briefly about this. In 1958, it's this really crucial moment in the Middle East, and it's also a really crucial moment in U.S. foreign policy. There's Egypt and Syria unify. Iraq has a revolution and deposes its monarchy. There's this really critical moment when the socialists and the communists in Iraq are vying for power. It's not clear which one is going to prevail. The United States had actually been backing the communists along with the Soviet Union, and their goal, of course, was to prevent Iraq, first to get Iraq away from the British Empire, and then next to prevent Iraq from going into the United Arab Republic sphere of influence, and they more or less succeed. They actually essentially pull this off, and the reason is because Iraq, after killing their king and becoming a republic, Iraqi communists go into the streets and denounce the idea of joining the United Arab Republic and merging with Egypt and Syria. And that worked to prevent that from happening. But at the same time, 2 other things happen. And one is that Iraq suggests that it should annex Kuwait back into itself. And the United States says, you do, we'll nuke Baghdad. And so the Iraqis go, we don't want Kuwait. You misunderstood us. Please don't nuke us, you crazy bastards. And then the other thing that happens at the same time is a civil war looks like it's on the verge of breaking out in Lebanon. And Eisenhower sends in the United States Marine Corps to prevent Lebanon from breaking into civil war. But really, that's not why. It was just a big excuse. The real reason we invade Lebanon in 1958 is to do a show of force against Egypt and Syria, and to sort of this trend towards unification, and to maybe suggest that the United States is not unwilling to use an invasion to prevent this. So Iraq ends up not joining the United Arab Republic. This may or may not have mattered, because 3 years later, in 1961, Syria secedes from the United Arab Republic, and the experiment failed. It lasted only 3 years. It fails because Gamal Abdel Nasser, the guy who ends up being the leader of the United Arab Republic, botches it. He fails to pull this off. For all the good that Nasser did, he did plenty of good for Egypt. This is one of those instances where he just really screwed up. I mean, he just failed to pull off what was necessary. And as a result, the UAR breaks. The Iraqi leadership actually sends a signal to Syria and Egypt saying, we haven't given up on this idea of a United Arab Republic. If you guys change your mind and want to do it down the road, we would like to join into a union. So strangely enough, the country that should have joined and balked ends up trying to promote it, and Nasser's response is forget about it. What happens then, shortly afterwards, is the president of Iraq is assassinated. His name is Qasim, and what ends up following is a period of extreme instability in Iraq. They have one military coup after the other. A party will get into power, and then it'll be overthrown, and Iraq becomes this really kind of rough and tumble place. And the same happens to Syria. Iraq and Syria kind of descend into chaos. And this will be the case for about a dozen years. Finally, around 1970, both Iraq and Syria more or less stabilize. And the reason is because of a political party called the Ba'ath Party. It's actually the Ba'athist Socialist Party. And the reason they stabilize it is they come to power in both Syria and Iraq at roughly the same time. Ba'ath just means renaissance. And the idea behind the party is that the Arabs need to undergo a renaissance, an intellectual renaissance, a cultural renaissance, and emerge as a fully modern socialist Arab state. That's their goal. They're socialists, they're secularists, they're for modernity, and they think that they can do this by creating this political party and gaining control, and they do in Syria and Iraq, and instead of working together, they end up becoming bitter rivals. So the Syrian Ba'athists hate the Iraqi Ba'athists, and the Iraqi Ba'athists end up hating the Syrian Ba'athists. The Syrian family, or the Syrian president, his name is Hafez al-Assad. He's the father of the current Syrian president. He takes over in 1970, and he's from the Alawite minority. The Alawites are a type of Shia, and so the non-Alawite Shia, the Alawites, the Christians in Syria kind of form together as the three largest minority religions in Syria and kind of co-rule Syria over the majority Sunni population. In the meantime, in Iraq, a country that's majority Shia, so Syria is majority Sunni, but the Shia take over. In Iraq, a country that's majority Shia, the Sunnis take over. So the Ba'athists in Syria are Shia, and the Ba'athists in Iraq are Sunni, and the majority Sunni country, Syria, gets ruled by Shia, and then the majority Shia country, Iraq, gets ruled by Sunnis, and it's sort of this weird upside-down little world. The president of Iraq is old, he's sick, he's not very effective, and pretty quickly Saddam Hussein rises through the ranks of the Ba'athist party and ends up effectively running the country, even though there's another person in charge, the president. It's during this time period that we start to put out feelers to see what kind of person Saddam Hussein is and whether or not we can work with Iraq. And before long, we establish sort of a covert relationship with Saddam Hussein. He's not even president yet, but we've been talking to him. We've had relations with him in the past. The CIA had actually bought him off at some point. In the late 70s, after he finally does become formally president, I think it was 78 or 79, the CIA approached Saddam Hussein again with a list of 800 Iraqis that the US didn't like. And the idea was to kind of find out what kind of a man Saddam Hussein was. And so we drop off the list. Saddam Hussein has the 800 people. They're university professors, they're school teachers, they're MDs, they're lawyers. They're all lefties. They're all socialists and communists. He has them arrested, and then he tries them in a big kangaroo-style court, and then he has them hanged en masse. Like, they just go into the middle of a square and they hang all 800 at the same time, and they broadcast it live on TV. And we go, wow, we can work with this guy, right? This is quite a statement. We give you a list. We don't tell you what to do with the list. You take the liberty of getting rid of these folks for us. It's our man. In the meantime, something strange kind of happens. Something strange is happening, and it's in Iran. So, did we talk about? We talked about Mossadegh last time, right? And how far did I get with Mossadegh? I don't remember. Okay, so let's go do the Mossadegh story. We'll just start it from the beginning. We can just always delete it from last time's lecture if I'm being redundant. So here's what happened. So in 1950, Mossadegh, the president of Iran, or prime minister, I think, prime minister of Iran, takes over, and the first thing he wants to do is nationalize the oil company. He wants to switch the Anglo-Iranian oil company into the national Iranian oil company. And he knows from the 1906 overthrow of the Iranian government that the British will use their embassy to overthrow his government. So the first thing he does is he shuts down the British embassy. He tells the Brits, "You're out of here. We're going to nationalize everything, but now you won't have your base of operations," right? Because that's the number one purpose for an embassy. You know that, right? It's so that because embassy staff have criminal immunity. So what you do is you send your assassins in as embassy staff, and you send in your spies, your CIA operatives, and then you work within the country with criminal immunity, and then you just basically do whatever the hell they want to, and then, right? Because that's the number one purpose of an embassy, is to spy. Yeah. And then, like, only secondarily or tertiarily is it for negotiating with that country. So the first thing Mossadegh does is he throws a British embassy out. Well, the Brits come to the United States and go, oh my God, right? The AIOC, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, eventually becomes British Petroleum. The British Petroleum has just been gutted. It's just lost its primary oil source. They're just now realizing that there's North Sea oil. It's not something they've actually started tapping into yet. And so they're horrified. What do we do? Will you help us? And President Truman comes back and he says, the United States doesn't go around overthrowing democracies. Which was really weird because we totally do that, and we were already doing that by then. So it's like, what alternate universe United States did Truman know about? But anyway, he refuses to help the British. In 1952, Eisenhower is running for president. And the British, before he's even elected, go to Eisenhower and say, when you get into office, will you go and overthrow this government in Iran for us? And Eisenhower says, of course. The United States and Great Britain are great friends. You get into trouble because somebody has a democracy, we'll help you get rid of it. So in 1953, Eisenhower tells the CIA, overthrow the Iranian government. The guy in charge of operations in Iran is none other than Kermit Roosevelt. Kermit Roosevelt happens to be the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, as in the former president. Kermit Roosevelt, and this is before he gets the job with the Muppets, Kermit Roosevelt goes and bribes Iranian military officials, and he says, let's do a military coup. And he talks them into it with a little bit of money. Money always helps. And they go to arrest Mossadegh at night. They go and they knock on the door, and Mossadegh actually opens the door. He's like, hello. And there's these Iranian military officials. Kermit Roosevelt's hiding in the bushes watching. And there's these Iranian military officials, and they go, you're under arrest. And Mossadegh goes, nope, you are incorrect. And they go, what do you mean? And he goes, you're under arrest. And men pop up out of the bushes and arrest the guys trying to overthrow the government. Kermit runs. he just takes off. And at that point, Eisenhower is appalled. He's horrified because this thing just backfired and turned ugly. So he orders the overthrow of the Iranian government stopped. They'll regroup and do it later. Roosevelt goes rogue. He's not interested in losing. And so he actually goes and meets with Norman Schwarzkopf. Schwarzkopf is, as in Stormin Norman, right? The guy in charge of the first war against Iraq? Not that guy. His dad. So for those of you who haven't figured it out yet, in the United States, stuff like this is passed on from father to son or father to grandson as appropriate, because we are a hereditary nobility. We just pretend we're not. And it's, of course, all about money. So I guess if you lost the money, you would lose your noble status. But anyway, so he goes to Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., and he says, what should I do? Well, Schwarzkopf Sr. was actually a businessman, very rich, who had had dealings with the Iranians, and he actually helps Kermit come up with a plan to overthrow the Iranian democracy. And here's the plan. It's actually Iranians are going to kill me, but it's actually quite ingenious. What they do is they go and they get unemployed Iranians, young men, and they pay them money to go stage demonstrations. And they show up with signs, and the signs say, we support Mossadegh. The government that he's trying to overthrow, he has these guys show up with these signs, and they protest through the streets, and then they end the protest with violence. They'll go smash storefronts up, flip cars upside down, set buildings on fire, and they'll do this day after day after day. So it looks like Mossadegh supporters are these crazy violent youth gangs. And then, of course, this is totally destabilizing to the government. And as time goes by, people start to think, okay, we need to do something about it. And eventually the army steps in and puts Mossadegh under house arrest. And that's how, in 1953, the United States overthrew the Iranian democracy. So what had happened was, in World War II, Great Britain and Russia had actually invaded Iran. And while they were in Iran, they went to Reza Shah was the leader of Iran. He was the monarch of Iran. They went to his son and said, hey, how do you feel about becoming the new leader of Iran? And he said, well, there's this little issue of my dad. And the British said, no, we'll depose him and just put you in. So they do that, and then in the aftermath of World War II, the Shah, the son, ends up becoming a little bit of a dictator, but not particularly powerful. And then Iran democratizes, they have democratic elections, and then we go in and overthrow their democracy and effectively install the Shah as the tyrant of Iran. The Shah then rules for the next 25 years as a brutal tyrant. If you criticize his regime, you're thrown in jail. People are disappeared, presses are regularly shut down. There's no criticism of his government. During that time, something really strange happens. And it's that Iranians sort of embrace this idea of the nickname that Iran gets really early on, which is Little America. Shopping malls pop up. Bleach becomes the most purchased product in Iran so that everybody can be blonde. Nose jobs, by the way, Iranians still do nose jobs. You walk down the streets. I've been to Tehran. I was in Tehran in 2002, and about 10% of the female population had the little splint you get after you've had a nose job. And they of course, advertise. Like, you walk around with a little splint because you're showing, yeah, I did it. I mean, and the nose job, of course, is to make you look like you have a white person's nose. And then the bleach for the blonde hair, because there's serious self-hate involved in this idea that Iran is somehow a little America. Gugush, which is like the most popular singer at the time, or one of the most popular singers, her album has her standing like this, and she's got pistols in her hands and a cowboy hat, and she's wearing cowboy boots, right? And she's Iranian. So it's sort of this weird, like, whoa, what's going on here? In late 1978, the Shah, the tyrant that we've installed, is sick. He has cancer. He leaves the country to go get medical treatment. In January of '79, there's a full-fledged revolution against him. He can't go back now because he's done. He's finished. The question is how this revolution is going to end. And interestingly enough, we had something up our sleeve, a person actually up our sleeve in Iraq, and his name is the Ayatollah Khomeini. So the two forces in Iran that did the revolution to overthrow the government that was pro-US, the two forces are the communists on one side and then the Islamists on the other side. So the US is facing a serious foreign policy catastrophe. Iran was such a good US ally that only 3 states on Earth ever owned the F-14. At the time, right, probably the best fighter bomber in the air. The F-14 was an amazing aircraft. It was the United States, Great Britain, and Iran. Not even Israel had F-14s. Iran did. And so here's this country that we've invested so much into, that we've even to the point where we're giving them our best equipment, now having an anti-US revolution. And in part, it's a rejection of the cultural swing that got Iran the nickname Little America. They're like, why do we want to be Americans? We're Iranians. We have a civilization at that point. Iranians had a civilization that was, like 2,500, 2,600 years old, and they're imitating a civilization that's 200 years old. And there's a little bit of not only self-hate in it, it'd be like a parent imitating a 5-year-old child. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And so there's a little bit of reaction that way, but then there's also and then you gave us a quarter century of tyranny and you overthrew our democracy. We're done with the United States. We want to go our own way. So the question for the United States is, we've just lost one of our best allies. Certainly our best ally in the Middle East. What do we do to recover? If Iran goes communist, now Iran will be in the Soviet sphere of influence. If Iran goes Islamist, Iran will hate the Soviets because their avowed religion is atheism. So they won't go to the Soviets, and they won't go, we'll lose them, but the Soviets won't gain them. And so what we did was we told Saddam Hussein, you have custody of Ayatollah Khomeini, let him go, release him. Let him go into Iran. He had been in France, and then he had left for France to Iraq to be closer because he wants to foment this Islamist revolution. We actually help him get from Iraq into Iran. He gets into Iran, and sure enough, the Islamists win the revolution. And even though the communists had worked with the Islamists to have the revolution, as soon as the pieces fall into place, the Islamists execute the communists. So now the communists are out of the picture, and the Islamists take over, and they create the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the Ayatollah Khomeini takes over. The United States decides, we're not done. We're not done. But before we get to what the United States does in an act of vengeance, let me just talk about the Iran hostage crisis. So the revolution happens. The U.S. Embassy is mostly shut down. We have a skeleton staff. And what ends up happening is a group of college students, kids your age, get together and march on the U.S. Embassy. Well, as they're marching towards the embassy, the Iranian government calls up the U.S. Embassy and says, get out. And the reason they want them to get out is because an embassy is sovereign territory of the state that is represented at the embassy. And those students, the Iranian government knows, those students have the intention of capturing the U.S. Embassy. Technically, those students will be in the act of invading U.S. territory at that moment. They will be defying U.S. sovereignty, which means that at that moment they will create an international incident. And the new revolutionary government doesn't want to have to deal with an international incident. This is just bad. There's no one's going to win this. So they tell the U.S. Embassy staff to get out, what's left of it. And a few people do, but about 50 people don't. They ignore the warning. And the reason is because they're desperately shredding the documents that they have in the embassy. Because the documents do stuff like chronicle the U.S. overthrow of the Iranian government in 1953 and everything the United States did that was nasty in Iran afterwards. And so that's why the students are going to the embassy. They want those documents because the United States has always denied, up until recently in fact, that the U.S. had anything to do with the overthrow of the Iranian democracy in 1953. So the students want to capture those documents to prove that the United States did this. They climb over the wall, and sure enough, they find shredded documents everywhere. And they find those 50 CIA operatives, right? This isn't embassy staff. These are the CIA hacks who have been left to get rid of the evidence. And they're like, oh. And the students capture them. And then they take those shredded documents. They have a bunch that they didn't even get to that's not shredded, but they want the shredded stuff because that's probably the best, right? They probably prioritized it. They take the shredded stuff and they put them in bags, and they walk over to nearby schools and they go, kids, you like puzzles? And they dump them out on the floor and they go, put these together. And they do. So we have all of those documents. The CIA effectively, they should have lit them on fire or something. They screwed this up. They didn't quite actually get rid of them. Now here's what's really amazing. And it shows you how much faith we had in the idea that Iran was permanently a US ally. It turned out that the Tehran embassy wasn't just our headquarters for all CIA operations in Iran. It was headquarters for all CIA operations in Asia. So when those kids got a hold of all of those documents, they didn't just have proof, categorical proof that the US overthrew their government in 1953. They also had the names of all the active CIA agents in all of Asia. And the kids went to the nearby Xerox machine and began copying everything. And they basically said, anybody wants this info? Here it is. The whole world, you can have it. As punishment for our overthrow of their government in 1953. So in an instant, the CIA experiences one of the worst catastrophes that it's ever endured because it has to pull all its active agents out of Asia because they'll be killed otherwise, because their name, their location, what they're doing, all of that is now known to whomever. So basically the CIA gets wiped out in Asia, gets wiped out and has to start over. The students then say, okay, here's the proof. 1953. We even know his name, Kermit Roosevelt. Your documents. We want the United States to apologize. And of course, the United States categorically will never apologize. We will never take responsibility for anything we do. And so no, not going to happen. Students go, okay, we'll just keep these 50 CIA hacks as hostages until you do. At which point the Iranian government's like, ah! Because they had hoped the students would capture the documents and then release the 50 CIA hacks, and then, the incident can be over. It's bad, it's a disaster for them, but now the students just hunker down. They're like, no, you're never going to see these 50 guys again until you apologize. And of course, Jimmy Carter, the president at the time, is never going to apologize. So this is a problem. Months go by, and in that time period that the months that are going by is happening, the Iranian government is desperately negotiating with the students to get them to release the hostages so that they can get past this crazy incident. And finally, in 1980, or early 1980, in spring of 1980, the Iranians negotiate a deal with the students to get the hostages released. The US, we find out, we hear word that this is about to happen. Members of the Reagan presidential campaign jump on an airplane, fly to Iran with suitcases filled with cash. They walk in. Rafsanjani was the guy doing the primary negotiating. They walk in, they meet with Rafsanjani. They got the suitcases of money. And they walk into his office. And he goes, how can I help you? And they say, don't release the hostages. And he goes, I'm sorry, I thought you were from the US. And they go, yeah. You want us to keep the hostages? Yes, until after the November election. And they just put the suitcases of money on the desk, and they go, really, until after the election? Because if the hostages are released before November, Carter gets credit for releasing the hostages. If they're not released, Carter gets blamed for still having this hostage crisis going on. The hostages are released. They are released the day after Ronald Reagan is inaugurated president the next year, almost a year later. Isn't that cool?
So they just, sorry.
No, go ahead.
So they just lived in the embassy for a year?
I think it was more like a year and a half, year and 9 months, something ridiculous like that. And in fact, the news reports would start day 300 and whatever, day 400 and whatever, because they kept a running tally so you could keep up. Now every news broadcast started that way. We were obsessed with that. In the Vietnam War, we would start off with the casualties, and they would just show the numbers like it was score, like it's a game. It's like a football game, right? You're just sort of keeping track of the score. So now comes our vengeance. Iraq has an interesting land dispute with Iran. The land dispute is over a chunk of territory called Khuzestan. And the reason Iraq claims it is because the people who live there are Arabic speakers. Iraq is Arab. Iran is not Arab. Iran is Persian dominated, but it's a country made up of Persians and Kurds and Baluchis and Sistanis and Turks. There's Turkmen Turks, there's Azeri Turks, and then there's Arabs in the south. Turns out that the Iranian oil-rich region, Khuzestan, is Arab. So God wanted the Arabs to have so much oil that even the big non-Arab country that has a lot of oil, it's in the Arab part of their country, right? So what happened was Saddam Hussein in Iraq claimed Khuzestan because they wanted the Arabic-speaking part. Now, they really also are very happy about the idea of ending up with the really oil-rich part of Iran, because at that point, Iraq would be, if they got it, they would be totally rivaling Saudi Arabia for amount of proven oil in the ground. Iraq is number 2. So I believe at the time Iran was number 3. I don't know that it still is. So, it was number 2 and number 3 were going to merge. This was going to make a contest between number 2 and number 1 at that point. While Saddam Hussein is trying to figure out how he can get this piece of land, U.S. actually approaches Iraq. And the U.S.'s attitude is, look, you guys want this land. We have a good relationship with Saddam Hussein. We think we can work with you. We would like to suggest that you actually go ahead and attack Iran. They've just had this revolution. Their military was literally decapitated. The army generals were caught and executed. Some of the Navy admirals were captured, some of them escaped, and then the Air Force generals all flew away. So always go with the Air Force because you can get away so much easier. Navy's okay. Army, you're just dead. You're just not good. So the idea is Iran's military is in epic disarray. The revolutionary government hasn't straightened things out. Iran's in this really weak position. Now's the chance. And so Iraq does. Iraq attacks Iran and initiates the Iran-Iraq War. It'll last 8 years and it'll kill about 1 million people. I think I remember where we were last time. Was it when April Glaspie? Did we do that? No? Okay, forget about it. I'm just going to pretend last time didn't happen. We'll have to edit that out, Jeremy. Thanks. I think what happened was I talked about it in my U.S. government class. So, the Iran-Iraq War is this hideous war. About 1 million people die. 750,000 Iranians, about 250,000 Iraqis. Iran outnumbered Iraq about 3-1. The reason the Iraqis inflict such heavy casualties on Iran and the reason the Iranians don't win, they can't win even though they have numerical superiority, is Iraq had the technical and technological superiority. So even though Iraq was seriously outnumbered, it held its ground. But having said that, it completely failed to capture Khuzestan. In fact, it captured one city called Khorramshahr right on the border with it. Its number 2 objective was a city called Abadan, which in Arabic means never. Never attack a city named Never, apparently, because the Iraqis couldn't get it. They just couldn't pull it off. And because they couldn't capture Abadan, there was no way they were going to capture Khuzestan. So it was just a big, disastrous mistake on Iraq's part. I actually had the opportunity to do a battlefield tour of the Iran-Iraq War. I went to Khuzestan, and I got taken to what the Iraqis had done was they got so desperate they actually sent their tank units off independent of the infantry and tried to see if they could penetrate deep into Khuzestan, and they kind of got in, but the Iranian army just mobilized and just sent numerical superiority in the region and shoved them back out. The rest of the Iran-Iraq War ended up just basically right along the Iran-Iraq border with slight fluctuations here and there. For example, the city of Powell, which is in the very south, the Iranians call it Fav, in Arabic it's Fao. The Iranians managed to capture it, and it was a port city. It was Iraq's only port city. So that forced the Iraqis to build a new port city, and they actually did. They built a brand new port city just to the west of it so that they could still have a port city. But, we're talking about minor losses. Like the city of Fao was not a major gain for the Iranians. In terms of land, minor losses. In terms of life, we're epic. This is a disaster, full-on disaster. It represents a really interesting opportunity for Iraqi women, however, and for that matter, for Iranian women. Because so many men are in combat, somebody has to fill those civilian roles. So many men are in combat positions in the Iraqi army, for example, that are doctors because they're working in the field hospitals, that there needs to be doctors in the civilian capacity to fill those holes, and women step into place. And Iraq actually ends up going through a really interesting period where you see a lot of social and economic mobilization for women. In fact, the Iraqi parliament will get to 34% women, which is shocking, right? Because at the same time in the United States, in the 1980s, it was 1% of our Congress. In 1990, it had jumped to 2, it doubled. There were 2 women senators, and there were like 9 members of the House that were women out of 435. Whereas in Iraq, 34% ended up being women because the Iraqi government simply couldn't ignore women. They were just too important for the economy, considering how many men were dead and how many men were tied up into combat. Or came back maimed, right? There was a huge number of Iraqi men and Iranian men who just came back missing limbs, blind. We provided Iraq with the best equipment. Night vision goggles, we gave them gas masks, chemical suits, and we gave them chemical weapons. And the Iraqis used those chemical weapons in the war. The guy who gave me the battlefield tour of Khuzestan actually was an artillery officer, and they had captured an island in the middle of the Shatt al-Arab. The Shatt al-Arab is what happens when the 3 rivers in the area converge and merge into become one river. It's the Tigris and the Euphrates merge, and then shortly afterwards the Qarun, which comes from Iran, merges into it, and that's the Shatt al-Arab. And the Iranians had captured, it was the border between Iran and Iraq, they had captured an island in the middle of the river, and my friend's artillery unit was posted in that island, and it was a mortar unit and mortar battery, and they were firing mortar rounds into Iraq. And one day, he lived very close. He lived in a place called Ahwaz, or Dazfoul, I don't remember where he lived at the time. But anyway, he lived in a town nearby, and he wrote himself leave orders because he was just homesick, and he gave himself like 4 hours of leave. He took a ferry to the shore. He parked his personal car there, and he got in his personal car, and he drove 1 hour to the town he lived in at the time, and he went and had dinner and watched TV with his family for a couple hours, jumped in the car, drove back, gets to the ferry position, turns off his engine, walks over to the ferryman, and the guy goes, what do you mean? He goes, the Iraqis gassed the island while you were gone. Everybody's dead, you can't go. So the lesson I learned is if you ever get hungry and you feel like home-cooked food, go home. Just do it. That is the right thing to do. I promise. Always go for home-cooked meals. That's the lesson I got out of that. The Iraqis, and I asked him, I said, I know the answer, I just wanted to hear it from him. Why was it that the Iranians were having such a hard time, considering they were numerically superior at 3-to-1 ratio? And he said, we were fighting the U.S. We were fighting U.S. equipment. How do you do that? My men didn't have enough boots. So what we did was we had the men stand next to each other and find out who had roughly the same size feet, so that if a guy died, you knew whose feet to go get the boots off of. We didn't have enough jackets. And somehow we're supposed to fight this fully modern U.S.-equipped army. How are we supposed to do that? And of course, the whole time this is going on, the U.S. has told the world, nobody send weapons to Iran and Iraq so they'll stop fighting. In the meantime, we're just dumping weapons into Iraq. But don't worry, we were also selling to the Iranians. We sold to the Iranians at 4 times the market value. We sold to the Iraqis at below market value, and the Iranians, we quadrupled the price. Now, the reason we were willing to sell to the Iranians was because we don't care, we have no morality. And it was a Reagan administration. Like, if you're looking for morality in the Reagan administration, ooh, you're going to be sadly disappointed. But anyway, but the Iranian Air Force was entirely U.S. airplanes, including F-14s. Not many. There weren't many F-14s, but there were a few. And so the Iranians need U.S. spare parts desperately. And airplanes break down very regularly. You have to constantly replace. And so we were selling them spare parts at 4 times the market value. Technically, it was illegal and it was Oliver North, but still, nonetheless, he represented the U.S. even if he did it in a manner that was unconstitutional. And to prove it to you, we didn't execute him after we found him guilty. I would have thought that ignoring Congress was a violation of the Constitution, which is an act of treason, which should have gotten him executed by firing squad. Instead, he became a hero and ended up with a talk show in Virginia. So, the lesson learned there, if you can ignore Congress, do it, because you'll end up with a talk show and you'll be a celebrity. After you get up in front of Congress and talk about what you did, because they're going to make you explain, which happened. It was amazing. But then they won't shoot you, so don't worry, you're okay. The Iran-Iraq War ends. By the way, right before it ended, there was an Iranian airliner flying over the Arabian Gulf, flying over the Straits of Hormuz. I believe it was going to Oman. And right as it's over Oman, we shot it down. The United States Navy shot down an Iranian airliner. Oh, we don't look like hypocrites, do we? We're like, oh, Ukraine, whatever. If we hadn't done it, maybe we'd have ground to stand on. Did we apologize? No. And George Bush Sr. said, I'll never apologize. The United States doesn't have to apologize. The United States doesn't owe anybody anything. Really, you couldn't just say, geez, sorry, accident. We thought it was a combat aircraft, even though it looks nothing like one. So, the Iran-Iraq War ends. By the way, the U.S. press tried to claim that the 250 or 300 passengers that were floating in the Straits of Hormuz, that's what caused the Iranians to sue for peace, that they had finally had enough of the killing. Right, because the 750,000 who had died up until that moment wasn't enough incentive. Like, even the logic that the press tried to spin is so ridiculous that you could attempt to believe it would require you to have a 1984 Orwellian brain, right? It's just such a ridiculous leap. Oh, we made peace break out by shooting down an airliner. That's weird. We should just do that more often. Why hasn't it occurred to anybody? It's just a matter of shooting down passengers in planes. Of course, that peace didn't break out in Ukraine may suggest that that's not actually the formula or the best way towards peace. I'm just guessing. I'm going out on a limb here. Having said that, the Iran-Iraq war ends, and both Iran and Iraq are in a really bad situation economically. They're in really big debt. We didn't just give them the equipment, we sold it to Iraq, right? We're like, hey, you want to buy all this really fancy equipment? And Iraq went, yeah, of course, it's our only chance to prevent us from being defeated. In the Iran-Iraq war, one of the things that happened, of course, was the gassing of the village of Halabja. It was a Kurdish village. Iraq actually had a really good relationship with the Kurds for the most part up until that point. It's not that it was a perfect relationship, right? But it was a decent relationship. And in fact, the Iraqis allowed the Kurds to operate freely out of northern Iraq in military actions against Iran and Turkey. And so when the bombing of Halabja happened, it was actually kind of a weird thing. So 1,800 villagers, Kurdish villagers, died in this village that was gassed. And here's what happened. U.S. military intelligence had reported that the Iranian army had captured the village. And so the Iraqis decided to use that U.S. intel to then fly helicopters over the village and gas it at night, hoping to kill the Iranian soldiers in the village. What had happened is during the night, the Iranians had withdrawn, and the villagers who had fled the village when the Iranians showed up returned. So when the sun rises up, the Iraqis go, oh, oops, got a bunch of villagers. So sorry, right? That wasn't their intended target. The U.S. compensated for this by sending Jeane Kirkpatrick from the Reagan administration to go to Iraq to figure out a way to cover it up. And she concluded that the Iranians had gassed the village of Halabja. And that was the official Reagan position, was that the Iranians had done it, even though the Iranians never once used gas weapons in the Iran-Iraq war. So just for the record, so keep that in mind. So now, Iran and Iraq have ended the war. They're both in a little bit of trouble because they're in large amounts of debt. And so they both go to OPEC. Now, they're both members of OPEC. And OPEC, of course, is this oil cartel that's designed to control the price of oil, to regulate the world economy, and make sure that the countries that are members get a decent amount per barrel. They go to OPEC, and OPEC goes, all right, we need to help you guys get back on your feet. And so OPEC agrees. OPEC's broad. It's not just Arab and Middle Eastern states, right? Indonesia's a member, Venezuela's a member. There's actually a lot of countries that are in this thing. They get together and they say, look, let's make a deal. And everybody agrees to cut their share of the oil market. In return, Iraq will be allowed to increase its share. Iraq and Iran will increase their share. By the fact that everybody else is cutting, the amount of oil being produced will stay the same, so the price will stay the same, just that Iraq and Iran will get a bigger share, so they'll get more revenue. So they do this. And what happens is the price of oil plunges because somebody's cheating. And the cheaters are flooding the market with oil. So they had agreed to cut oil, but whoever is cheating is not only not cut oil, they've actually increased the amount of oil they're dumping in the markets. The Iraqi government tries to figure out who it is. They do a little bit of investigation. While that's happening, they also notice that where they have oil fields on the border with Kuwait, there are treaties, because the border goes through an oil field. So there's treaties about how much each side can pump out per year, because that's the way you'll split the field. If one side is pumping out too fast, since it's a fluid, both sides of the border, the oil goes down, right? So by pumping out faster than the treaty allows, you're effectively stealing the other side's oil. Iraq notices that its oil fields are dropping faster than predicted. So suggesting that the Kuwaitis are pumping the oil out in a rate that's breaking the treaty. So the Iraqis asked, Saddam Hussein, and this is in 90, asks the UN to come investigate to see what's going on. The UN investigation finds that, yes, in fact, the Kuwaitis are pumping too fast and they're lowering their oil fields on the border between Iraq and Kuwait. And then the UN Commission discovers that the Kuwaitis have built oil rigs in Kuwait across the border in places where there are no known oil fields, but that are close to known Iraqi oil fields that are entirely in Iraq. So it's not that Kuwait has a partial claim to these oil fields. So the UN investigators say, well, we're here, let's go look. And sure enough, they discover that Kuwait is slant drilling under the border right into Iraqi oil fields. And they're pumping the oil out, and they're stealing Iraqi oil to flood the oil markets to drive the price down. Iraq goes, wait, we made a deal so that we could recover, and you're doing this to us. And Iran, by the way, what's this about? And of course, what it was from a Kuwaiti foreign policy position was, they feared that if Iraq got back on its feet, it was a security issue for them. They were trying to hurt Iraq. Of course, this is kind of an act of war. Imagine if Mexico started slant drilling into Texas oil fields and pumping the oil out, we would go crazy. We would nuke Mexico City. We're so insane, right? We'd be like, I'll teach you. How do I know? Because we used to threaten to nuke everybody all the time, drop of a hat. Like Iraq, when they were going to go into Kuwait, ooh, we'll nuke you. Oh, that's mature behavior. First thing? Didn't you want to first say, we don't like that? Okay, we're going to nuke you. At least that could be the second thing. Anyway, so Iraq sends communiques to Kuwait. Kuwait ignores the communiques. And the Iraqi communiques are, please stop stealing our oil. And oh, by the way, will you stop flooding the markets? And Kuwait just ignores. And this goes on for weeks. It turns into months. Finally, Saddam Hussein in July of 1990 calls the U.S. ambassador to Iraq. Her name is April Glaspie. Calls her into the room for consultation. And he starts by saying Iraq and the U.S. have a fantastic relationship. And she goes, yes, I concur. It's a very good relationship. I'm paraphrasing, but this is the gist of what they say. And then he says, Kuwait's stealing our oil. She goes, yes. And the United States is on Iraq's side in regard to this matter. But we agree. Saddam Hussein then says, we have to do something about it. We can't just keep ignoring it, and they're not responding to our communiques. And she goes, yes. What happens between Arab states is of no concern to the United States. Kuwait's Arab, Iraq's Arab. What is that? That's permission. That's a green light. You can't interpret that any other way than, because he says we're going to have to do something about it. They're ignoring us. Not, we're going to go negotiate with them. He didn't say that. Because if they're ignoring you, what's the negotiation, right? Without saying we're going to attack Kuwait, he's saying we're going to attack Kuwait. And without her saying you have permission to attack Kuwait, she's saying you have permission to attack Kuwait because they're politicians. And politicians, by their nature, are really insecure scumbags. They never tell you exactly what they mean. They're always walking around, passive-aggressive, coming at it from behind. You know what I mean? Because they just no direct, because they can't, because they'll be held accountable later. So, a few days later, I think it was July 23rd, somewhere around there, when he brought April Glaspie in. A few days later, Iraq invades Kuwait. The battle takes 24 hours. It's one of the shortest invasions of a country in human history. I believe the only one that was shorter was when Germany invaded Denmark in World War II. That was 2 hours. There was the total casualty list was 1 German. I think 1 German and 1 German scout car, and that was it. And it took 2 hours, and the Danes surrendered. Like, okay, we're done. That was about 120 minutes too long. We quit. But in Kuwait's case, one of the reasons it took so long is it took that long for the Kuwaiti army to run into Saudi Arabia. Like they were having trouble getting out of Iraq's way. The Iraqis invaded with the Republican Guard. The Guard were the Iraqi elite units. Saddam Hussein gave them very strict orders: no pillaging, no raping, no excessive killing. You're just supposed to take out the Kuwaiti military. You're not supposed to damage anything. They go in. It's a surgical operation. 24 hours later, Kuwait is firmly in Iraqi control. Iraq makes it the 19th province. It tells the Kuwaiti royal family, which has already fled, they've fled to Saudi Arabia also, you're not welcome back, don't come back, you're done. It then declares that all Arabs living in Kuwait can have instant Iraqi citizenship. All non-Arabs can apply. The reason that's important is the population of Kuwait was 1.5 million in 1990. 500,000 were Kuwaitis, and 1 million were foreign workers who would never, ever, ever get Kuwaiti citizenship. They would always be permanently non-citizens. And this is Kuwait's arrangement. It has all this money, this oil wealth, and basically what it does is it imports a labor force that will then never have rights. Right? It's like not quite a slave labor force, obviously, but certainly not a privileged labor force. By Iraq doing this, it's basically extended to that million workers human rights that you would expect if you were a humane society. In addition, Iraq declares that women have all the rights of their secular society. By contrast, the Kuwaitis had been a monarchy with no parliament. The emir? I think he's an emir. I don't remember offhand. He had declared in 1986 that he didn't want to deal with parliament anymore. They were too obnoxious. And he dissolved them by decree and ruled Kuwait by decree. So for 4 years, he had been ruling Kuwait with a snap of his fingers. He would just make a law, and it became the law. That was it. There wasn't even the formality of a rubber stamp parliament. And so all of that is in an instant gone. Saddam Hussein tells the business leaders in Kuwait, you just keep running your businesses the way that you're running them. We're not going to take them from you. We're not confiscating stuff. He tells the political leaders, you're going to keep running Kuwait, but it's now a province in Iraq. Now, he has a couple of reasons for being this way. One is they're Arabs, right? Imagine if after the United States collapses, and the United States inherits Louisiana, and then Louisiana declares its independence, but we decide to go smash them and put them back in. We're not going to be particularly rough with them. They're from the U.S. So it's not like it's this vicious, it's not like what we did in Vietnam. It's not like what we did in Iraq, because we have no kinship with those folks, and because we are tribalists at the end of the day, we're happy to kill people who don't look like us. So that's one reason that he's being gentle with Kuwait. Another reason is Kuwait's a very oil-rich place. He wants to integrate it into Iraq. He's putting it into Iraq. It's going to become an integral part of Iraq. Immediately, reports start to pour in out of Kuwait about atrocities. Well, one source for atrocities. In fact, one person. It's not like there are reports. It's really just one report. And it's not like there's a bunch of people in that one report. It's just one person. And what this person says is that the Iraqi army had been raping airline stewardesses and had gone into a hospital and skewered Kuwaiti babies on bayonets and were parading around with the babies on bayonets. And of course, we're like, oh my God. Turns out she was a Kuwaiti princess working for the CIA. And she later on admitted she had lied about all of it. It never happened. None of it happened. So just in case you were wondering. Maybe we shouldn't rely on one witness without any photos. You know what I'm saying? Like maybe in the future we should treat international relations the same way we treat a criminal trial. Like, where's the witness? Where's the evidence? Where's the corroborators of this story? Where are the dead babies? Something would be great. But anyway, it doesn't exist. So the press is going nuts. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, the first thing George Bush Sr. did was he got up in front of the country and he said, at this moment, I don't see a problem with it. Of course he doesn't. He's the guy who gave Saddam Hussein the permission to do this. Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of Great Britain, jumps on an airplane and flies to Colorado. And I think they met in Vail or Aspen or Telluride or wherever. They meet at a ski resort. It's August. They're not going skiing. They're probably just having sex. And they meet. That's an image. Hold on. I'm trying to keep it. Yeah, don't distract me. They meet in Colorado. They fly to Colorado. And they talk behind closed doors. And they talk for about 2 days. And they get out of the talks. And George Bush Sr. says, he's a Hitler. That's Saddam Hussein, he's a Hitler. Actually, he looks way more like Stalin. But anyway, that's what I would have done. He's a Stalin, but he's a Hitler. Well, first of all, he's not a Hitler. He's a Hussein. So, there is a guy who is related to Hitler running around. He doesn't have the last name Hitler because they got rid of the name for obvious reasons. His name is Adolf, though. They did that. They actually named this kid Adolf. Like, really? You got to be kidding me. You got rid of the last name, but you kept the first? What's wrong with people? Anyway, so, I would have named him something like Christian or something, or Fred. Just to avoid anything Adolf-like. Like not Adolphus, not even Albert. So, he's a Hitler. He's a Hitler. He's 1,000 points of light. God, that's so obnoxious. This is like horrible 4 years. Horrible, bad speech writing. So he comes out and he says, we need to do something. We have to stop him. He's surely invaded Kuwait because he plans to conquer the entire Middle East. So he creates Desert Shield, and the U.S. slowly, and by slowly, there's that Monsters U, the movie. There's the kid, he's the snail, and he's like, I'm late for school. And he starts running. That's our deployment into Saudi Arabia. I mean, if it was any slower, Saddam Hussein would have died of old age. And we would have won. It takes us months to deploy. We start with the 82nd Airborne. They start going into Saudi Arabia. And at that moment, I had my proof that that Saddam Hussein had no intention of leapfrogging after Kuwait and invading other countries. And here's why. If you thought the United States was going to smash you into oblivion and that they were slowly deploying, well, that's the time to attack. If Iraq was really going aggressive, they should have waited until about half the 82nd Airborne was deployed into Saudi Arabia and then attacked. The Saudi military could not have stood up to the Iraqi military. It would have disintegrated like when you blow dust. They would just gone. Half of the 82nd Airborne being slaughtered by this overwhelming numerical superiority would have been really bad PR for the US. It would have been a political, diplomatic, and military catastrophe, and it would have been really hard for us to recover from, especially because then at that point we would have been sending our Marines as fast as we could because we had a thing called the Rapid Deployment Force stationed at Diego Garcia in the British Indian Ocean Territory. And they would have had to set them off as fast as they could to try and respond to this. And the timing is 2 weeks. It would have taken Iraq about 2 weeks to get to Oman. It would have taken about 2 weeks for the Marines to get to Oman. So we would have been fighting Iraq in Muscat, the capital of Oman, instead of fighting Iraq in Iraq. And that would have bought him time. And then he could have set fire to 40% of the world's oil resources. Right? Like if he really was the aggressive douchebag everybody was portraying him to be, that was the moment to go. Instead, he just let us deploy. He let us take 4.5 months, 5 months to just slowly put it. Let's put a little more. Here's some airplanes. Here's another aircraft carrier. Here's another aircraft. And he just let us build up and build up and build up and build up. And I've often wondered about this, like what was going through his tiny brain, his tiny little dinosaur walnut-sized brain. What was he thinking? The only thing I can think is he actually didn't think we would do it because we were friends. Donald Rumsfeld stuck his arm around Saddam Hussein's waist. And he said, Saddam Hussein is a very good friend of the US. Like, I don't think he got permission. He even went through the proper channels and got permission. And now all of a sudden he's like, wonder what Bush is up to. I'll play along. Surely it can't be bad for me. Right? Because after all, I'm the U.S.'s very good, I'm an ally who asked for permission to invade Kuwait. Why would they punish me for that? That doesn't, like, I think he just couldn't comprehend what a bunch of vicious bastards we really are. And at a drop of a hat, we were willing to just immediately abandon everything. Now, here's the question. What did Margaret Thatcher say to George Bush Sr.? Like, was it really that good a sex? Like, what was it that happened between them in Vale, Aspen, Telluride, wherever that was, he's a Hitler? And then here's what I think happened. I think there was a bunch of things. One thing is Kuwait was a British colony before it got its independence. And I think she saw it as, that's more erosion of the British Empire. How can I turn that around? I think another thing she thought was, the US has always wanted to have an air base in Saudi Arabia. And we did, we had one until the Saudis kicked us out because they got mad at us for supporting Israel so much. And so I think she went to him and she said, we want Kuwait back in the British sphere of influence, but we think you can get Saudi Arabia back in the US sphere of influence. We think that if you go to war against Iraq, you can, because the Saudis wanted it. The Saudis were begging us. You could tell the Saudis, we'll do it, but you fund the war. You'll pay for it. I believe the Saudis gave us $9 billion to do the war. You fund the war. And on top of it all, we get a permanent air base in Saudi Arabia. And I think that's how she talked them into doing it. And then there's another thing. There's all these weapon systems we've never tested. We can test them now, find out if they work, like the Patriot missile system, right? We never tested it. So we don't know if it works even in combat. We tested out in Nevada, but we've never actually tested it in combat. Turns out it was a hideous, hideous thing. It didn't work at all. It shot down exactly 0 Scuds in the war. It's 0. It actually hit 2 or 3 of them, but it didn't knock them out of the air. They just broke apart and then hit 2 or 3. They broke up into multiple, they basically merged multiple reentry vehicles, and the next thing you know, the Scud is hitting like 4 targets instead of 1 because it just broke up and then boom, 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 boom. So I was like, oh, that's fail. And then another thing that we have is in the United States, our military has to regularly get rid of its equipment. We actually have to dispose of it. That's very expensive. It's much cheaper to press a button and launch the thing. So we could take all that equipment that we were going to have to dispose of anyway and just fire it. I really think that's how shallow the decision-making got in Colorado. Next thing you know, we're going to do Desert Storm, where we turn the defense, we're defending Saudi Arabia. We turn that into, we're going to obliterate Iraq. The bombing campaign that ensued was 4 or 5 weeks long. In it, we dropped more tonnage of explosives on Iraq than everything used in World War II for the entire 8 years, including the 2 nukes. Let me say that again. The 8 years of World War II fought on 3 continents, right? Europe, Africa, and Asia. All the explosives that were dropped in World War II, including the 2 nukes dropped in Japan, did not amount to the same tonnage of explosives that we dropped on Iraq in that 4 or 5 weeks of the air campaign. We smashed Iraq into the Stone Ages. We blew up their hospitals, we blew up their schools, their police stations, their government buildings, their formula factories, their pharmaceutical plants. We blew up their bridges. We smashed Iraq. And then we attacked it. 5-day ground campaign. We hooked up, we headed toward Basra. The day that the ground campaign started, Saddam Hussein sent out a communique to George Bush Sr., we surrender. George Bush Sr. said, no, too late. He sent out another communique to George Bush Sr., we surrender. Bush ignored it. He sent a communique to the Soviet Union, to Mikhail Gorbachev, and said, hey, we surrender. There's no point in fighting. We can't win. We surrender. Mikhail Gorbachev called up George Bush Sr. and said, on behalf of the Iraqi people, I'm offering a surrender. And Bush said, no, we're not taking it. No surrender. Saddam Hussein ordered the troops in Kuwait to run away. as fast as they could. They confiscated every vehicle they could find, cars, buses, flatbed trucks, and they took off on the Basra highway from Kuwait, thousands of soldiers. And then we came in, I believe primarily with A-10s, but there might have been other equipment, and we dropped incendiary bombs all across the highway and just burned them to death. If you want, you can do a Google search and you can see a bunch of burnt Iraqi corpses, because there were photographers who went and took pictures. So you don't have to take my word for it. By the time it was done, we probably killed around 100,000 Iraqi civilians and probably somewhere around 85,000 Iraqi soldiers in 5 days of ground war following 5 weeks, 4.5 weeks of air war. And then we withdrew. We took Kuwait. The Egyptian army was in command of capturing Kuwait. US, French, and British forces went through the Iraqi desert on the way to Basra. We took Kuwait, and then the Allied forces withdrew from Iraq. And that was it. That was the war. Saddam Hussein was ordered to renounce Iraq's claim to Kuwait. A long-standing claim, right, since it had been part of the Basra province, before the British managed to carve it out of the Ottoman Empire in 1900. And Iraq did, temporarily. Then, a few years later, it actually it said, no, we take our claim back. But temporarily, anyway, they took the claim away. Shortly afterwards, George Bush Sr. got on TV and announced to the world, he doesn't, not even bother talking to Saddam Hussein, right? He announces to the world that all Iraq has to do to get back into the community of nations, because he doesn't know the meaning of the word nation, get back in the community of nations, is to give up its weapons of mass destruction. Now, everybody knew what they meant. What Senior meant was that he had to give up the chemical weapons that the US had supplied Iraq. And so Saddam Hussein did. He took all the chemical weapons and he put them in the desert. He had the army take them out in the desert, different locations, and blew them up. In the act of, in August, he blew them up.
Are these the weapons that we sold for 4 times as much?
No, we didn't. Those were the weapons to Iran. We actually sold those for market value to Iraq. He takes them out in the desert and blows them up. In August of 1991, he blows up all of it, as far as we know, 100%. Well, the UN weapons inspection regime shows up shortly afterwards, and really early on, one of the guy who ends up in charge of it is a guy named Scott Ritter, who had been a Marine, a US Marine. He's a self-proclaimed conservative Republican. He goes to the Iraqis and goes, okay, show me your weapons of mass destruction. Well, first of all, chemical weapons are not weapons of mass destruction. That's wrong. Biological and nuclear weapons are weapons of mass destruction. Chemical weapons are more of a combat terror weapon because they're really scary, because they do horrible things like burn your lungs, right? But they don't necessarily kill in large numbers any more than conventional weapons do. You can drop conventional bombs on a city and smash it into the Stone Ages, and in many ways it's more efficient and easier than dropping chemical weapons, in part because chemical weapons, they could get blown away by the wind. Air conditions matter. If you have, the pressure in the atmosphere can change the effectiveness of the chemical weapons. It's a little unreliable, and you could kill your own troops too, right? Because if the wind blows the right direction, you drop the chemical weapons right back onto your own troops. In Verdun, since we're in World War I now, right? Because we just did the 100th anniversary of its start. At Verdun, the Germans dumped chemical weapons all over the French positions. There were these incredibly uber-fortified French positions. They had elevators that went under the ground, and they were just massive underground bunkers, and they just obliterated the population of French soldiers, murdered them all with this chemical weapons. But then the Germans were worried that if they sent their troops in too quickly, their troops would get affected by those chemical weapons. So the German army hesitated. While they were hesitating, the French reinforced the positions, and then the Germans, when they attacked fully reinforced French positions. So, 2 million dead on both sides after that nightmare ends. So chemical weapons kind of suck. They're not very effective. They're just not. Having said that, the Iraqis go, we don't have any chemical weapons. Scott Ritter goes, no, I know you have chemical weapons. He then shows them the receipts. Right? We kept our copy, the merchant copy of the receipts. Here, even had the serial number for every. How do you think we had the serial numbers? That's because we're the ones who sold them, those rockets. You had VX, you had Sarin, right? It shows them here. Look, the Iraqis go, yeah, we had them, but you said we had to get rid of them. We did. We blew them up. Because you blew them up? Yeah, we didn't think you wanted anybody to find out who was giving us the chemical weapons. So we thought we were helping you by getting rid of the evidence. So he's like, all right, show me where the weapons were. So they take them out into the desert, and they set up sifters. And they sift through the sand, and they're looking for the serial numbers. From 1992 to 98, that's the primary task of the UN weapons inspection regime, is to go into the desert and sift the sand looking for the serial numbers for the rockets. In that 6 years, Scott Ritter found 98%. In fact, he was ready in 1998 to give Iraq the clean bill of health. He was ready to say, done. You're 98%. There's 2% floating out there. You're not a threat to us. In fact, even the 2% wouldn't have been a threat to anybody, not even Iraq's neighbors. Not a threat to the United States. They didn't have the capacity to launch them to us. They didn't have intercontinental ballistic missiles. They had short-range missiles. They could get them to Israel, maybe. They could get them to Lebanon. They could get them to Turkey or Saudi Arabia or Iran. But that was about as far as they could go. The problem is, those chemical weapons had a shelf life of 7 years. The last time we delivered them to Iraq was 88 and 89. That would be 95, 96. In 98, those chemical weapons were 2 years past their shelf life. I'm sure they still had some deadly effect. I'm sure it wasn't that they just suddenly turned them completely inert. You know, it's like, whoop, you got to throw them away. But they're not full potency. So they're not a threat for all intents and purposes anymore. And most likely, the Iraqis blew them up, but when they got blown up, the serial numbers got lost, and no amount of sifting was ever going to retrieve those serial numbers. So at that point, it was probably 100%. Right before he's ready to give the clean bill of health, before Scott Ritter's ready to do this, there was, I think, one more location they needed to inspect. Bill Clinton orders him out. He goes, no, I've got one location left, and I'm done with my job. Let me go investigate it. Bill Clinton says, I'm ordering you out because I'm going to bomb Iraq. Why are you bombing Iraq? You ready? Iraqi radar turned on for a U.S. fighter jet flying over Iraq. I don't even think it locked on. I think it just turned on. So they picked up the radar blip. And so now Iraq is going to be bombed as punishment for turning on their radar. Scott Ritter is like, wait, what? They turned on the radar so they get bombed? I'm so close to finishing. I've just spent 6 years of my life. Let me finish this thing. And Clinton goes, get out, and then bombs Iraq. The US news reported on the press that lies to you on a regular basis, on every issue, reported Saddam Hussein throws out UN weapons inspection regime. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Bill Clinton ordered the weapons inspection regime out. Now here's the weird thing. So you ask yourself, why? Why not let them complete the process? Every time something went wrong in the US, we would bomb Iraq. I think that Bill Clinton realized that Iraq was a really useful tool. He could distract the US with a bombing of Iraq every time something went wrong, like his penis ended up in the wrong mouth or something. He just, well, in that case, he bombed Afghanistan and Sudan, but you know, it's the same kind of thing. Oh, oops, right? You know, of course, one of those cruise missiles, they're kind of the same, except that cruise missiles are a little bit more accurate. They hit their target 20% of the time, as opposed to a Scud. Who knows where that's going to land? They're the smart bombs. They actually hit 20% of the time. One of them actually missed Afghanistan entirely. It landed in Pakistan. Like just, wow, you missed the country. Well, that's accurate. Where do I get those? I want one. Just one. That's all I need. So It'll hit my target 1 out of 5 times. I guess I need 5. So anyway, something weird happens. When we do Desert Shield, we impose sanctions on Iraq. Those sanctions get upgraded, and they eventually include everything. Food, medicine, everything. Hardware to rebuild things like bridges, to rebuild things like schools, factories, everything is on. You can't sell it to Iraq, Iraq can't buy it. They're the most brutal sanctions ever imposed on a state in human history. The UN estimates that 100,000 Iraqis died as a direct result per year. Those sanctions were in place. Those sanctions were in place for about 12 years. So it's at least 1.2 million Iraqis. During the 8 years of the Clinton administration, when the UN says 800,000 Iraqis died because of those sanctions, the estimate is that 500,000 of them were age 5 and younger. In other words, in the 8 years of the Clinton administration, we killed 500,000 Iraqi children by starving them or depriving them of medicine. One of the things that we used in the first war against Iraq was depleted uranium shells. Depleted uranium isn't depleted at all. It's still fully radioactive material, and we dusted all of southern Iraq with this stuff. It has a half-life of 4.6 billion years. So in 4.6 billion years, there will be half as much depleted uranium in southern Iraq as there is now. In other words, since the sun is going to nova in 3 billion years, we contaminated Iraq, for all intents and purposes, forever. Depleted uranium, because it's a radioactive material, has radioactive side effects. For example, the cases of cancer in southern Iraq are through the roof. And it actually ends up affecting really young people, including children. There's a really high rate of 8-year-old girls, for example, who end up with breast cancer in Iraq. Like, it's this weird situation that's inexplicable except for the depleted uranium. The depleted uranium, by the way, may be one of the contributing factors, if not the primary contributing factor, for Gulf War syndrome, which the U.S. has finally admitted is affecting somewhere probably around 80,000 U.S. soldiers that it served in Iraq. The U.S. Department of Defense had actually put out a paper saying we ought never use depleted uranium in a battlefield situation where we'll have troops on the ground, which is exactly what we did. We used depleted uranium in a battlefield situation where we had troops on the ground. So that could be the cause of Gulf War syndrome. Having said that, when the UN weapons inspection regime is pulled out by Bill Clinton in '98, Saddam Hussein doesn't allow it to return. So after Iraq is bombed, Saddam Hussein says, I'm done with your game. I don't know, next time you're about to complete this process, because they're going to have to start partially over, right? Because they're going to have to go investigate all the sites because they haven't had any eyes on the ground to make sure that that they will remain clean. So they're going to have to start partially. He's like, this is just a game. You investigate, you bomb me, investigate, you bomb me, I'm done with you, you're gone. Forget about it, don't come back. So then, of course, Junior gets elected president. He gets elected president in a botched election. He loses the popular vote, and he lost Florida, it turns out. It's unhappy surprise, but a university in Florida did a recount on their own time. They published the recount in October of 2001. If they had recounted the 3 counties Al Gore had asked for, it was slightly pro-George Bush Jr., but within the margin of error, so it was inconclusive. But it was slightly pro-George Bush Jr. If they had recounted the whole state of Florida, it was a Gore win, well beyond the margin of error. Florida was a Gore win. All he had to do was recount to find out Florida was a Gore win. So in other words, Gore actually won the 2000 election. This was a real problem for George Bush Jr. He had a catastrophic legitimacy crisis. Now, one way to resolve a legitimacy crisis is a war. So when he was elected, when Al Gore surrendered in December of 2000, I immediately turned to my wife and I said, George Bush Jr. will attack Iraq now. And she said, why? And I said, because he needs a war to solve his legitimacy crisis. First thing he does, flies spy planes over the People's Republic of China And then the People's Republic of China responds by taking planes to go intercept those planes. And you're too young to remember this, but one of those jets slammed into one of our spy planes, forcing our spy plane down. The Chinese pilot's dead. His plane is lost. We do an emergency landing in the People's Republic of China. And I'm like, oh my God, this guy's crazy. He's going to resolve his legitimacy crisis by starting a war with the PRC. I knew he was dumb, and I knew he was crazy, but I had no idea how dumb and how crazy. This is like, woohoo! You know what I mean? Wow, what a mistake this was, not protesting in November and December and trying to get a recount in Florida. This is going to get us all killed in World War III so that he can establish his presidency as legitimate. And then 9/11 happens. Like a gift, like manna from heaven, like God went, I love you, George. Here, I'm going to do 9/11 so you can have your legitimacy crisis end. It happens in September, and then in October, that Florida University releases its report. No one cares. At that point, we're all getting crew cuts, the men are, and shaving their beards and going off to war because we're going to go kill someone. Now, the problem is the 19 people we want to kill are already kind of dead because they were on those planes. So it's actually going to be really tricky to do vengeance. Now you say, well, but the people who organized them and got them to go do this, they're alive. Okay, yeah, the leadership is alive in Afghanistan. They're not from Afghanistan, but they're in Afghanistan, right? Of the 19 hijackers, 15 were Saudis, 2 were Egyptians, 1 was Lebanese, and 1 was Algerian. Not a single one from Afghanistan. And of the top leadership of al-Qaeda, not a single one was from Afghanistan. They were all from Saudi Arabia and Egypt, our allies. You know you're in trouble when your enemy has as its number one recruiting ground your allies. That means you're doing something wrong. You want me to tell you what the thing that we're doing wrong is? Supporting tyranny. U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is to prop up these really nasty tyrants like Mubarak in Egypt, like the Saudi royal family in Saudi Arabia. We prop them up, we support them, we aid them, we help them, and then the public turns against us because they go, why are you helping a tyrant brutalize me and my family and my friends? And then that turns into hate. And the next thing you know, it turns into a recruiting ground for our enemies. The guys that we want, we can't get. Well, we could go to Afghanistan, we could kill the guys who ordered them to go do this attack. The problem is that means going to war with a country that's innocent. Afghanistan didn't attack us, didn't threaten to attack us, didn't have the means to attack us, and didn't help attack us. In fact, to make this twist even weirder, the bin Laden family is a highly respected Saudi family. In fact, Osama bin Laden's dad was not only personal friends with George Bush Jr., but bailed George Bush Jr. out when he bankrupted his second company, Arbusto. So like, this is confusing. Like, where do these cutting lines? Our biggest enemy is actually our president's good friend's son. Like, is this a family feud? Do they have a spat? And it's a gift, right? This is the best thing that ever happened to Bush administration. So, we go to war with Afghanistan. It would be like if we got together, we decided we were going to be terrorists, right? Here, we're the leadership cadre, and you're the guys who are going to do the suicide attack. And here's what we do. We go to the People's Republic of China, and then so we're in the People's Republic of China. You go to other countries, like, I don't know, Germany or something. You train, and then you go to Russia, hijack airplanes, and fly them into Russian buildings. What country should Russia attack?
Where were we from?
Texas.
Why were we in that other place?
People's Republic of China? I don't know, but that's, in this analogy, that's who Russia should attack, is the people, right? To keep this consistent, you attack the country they were operating out of. Now you say, well, that's where they are, that's where the terrorists are. On September 12th, the Taliban leadership of Afghanistan sent a communique to the US saying, we will help you find the leaders of al-Qaeda and we will help you capture them. And we went, no, we're attacking you.
Say that one more time.
On September 12th, the Taliban leadership in Afghanistan told the US administration, told George Bush Jr.'s government, we will help you find al-Qaeda. And we said, no, we're attacking. Now here's the next weird thing. We don't have to go in and conquer Afghanistan. We have a thing, they're called special forces. They're elite troops, like SEALs, Rangers, those guys. We could just send in special forces and do kind of a surgical thing and go after top leadership. But we don't. We go full invasion. And here's the next twist. The guys who had been fighting the Taliban, the number one enemy of the Taliban, was actually Iran and Iran's allies in Afghanistan. Now, we were involved in Afghanistan, of course. In fact, Charlie Wilson, right here in Texas. Charlie Wilson is the guy who is the architect of US support for al-Qaeda and the Taliban and the Mujahideen when they were on our side fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. When we were actually helping Osama bin Laden and his buddies with US taxpayer money and US weapons and CIA training camps originally in Pakistan, but later on right in Afghanistan. And then those guys were fighting the Soviet Union. They defeat the Soviet Union. Fourth empire in like 100 years to be defeated by Afghanistan, 150 years. The British were defeated 3 times and then the Soviet Union was defeated. In a 150-year span of time, the British, the most powerful empire on earth, was beaten 3 times in Afghanistan. And then the Soviet Union, Afghanistan earned Graveyard of Empires as its nickname. That is theirs. Like they have that copywritten. We go through and supply these guys with all these weapons. Charlie Wilson, after Afghanistan wins, Charlie Wilson goes back to Congress and goes, great, they won. The guys we've been helping won. Now let's go build them hospitals and roads. Let's spend some money building hospitals and roads and schools and help them get back on their feet. Not a dime. The US never sent the Afghans a dime. Their thought was, when we were hurting the Soviet Union, you were so eager to help us. As soon as we did your dirty work for you, you dumped us. Oh, we get it. We could have spent a tiny fraction of what we spent arming them to help them rebuild. We spent not a dime. What ended up happening is Afghanistan ended up in this bloody civil war. So they fight the Soviets, beat them, drive them out. They lose like 1.5 million people defeating the Soviets, by the way. It's an epic disaster for them. Their infrastructure is smashed, their cities are in ruins. They beat the Soviets, they get them out, and then they end up in a bloody civil war, in part because they have limited resources and they're trying to figure out who's going to get them. And all that probably would have taken to prevent the civil war was a little bit of aid from us. And we don't do it, they end up in a civil war, and the Taliban take over. And the Taliban are really nasty little bastards. It's really hard to describe them in pleasant ways, right? Especially when it comes to women's rights. But you don't even have to go there. You can just do what they do with historical sites. They blow them up. Right before 9/11 happened, they blew up these statues of the Buddha. Buddhism left India and went west before it went east. And it actually went across Afghanistan right into Iran before it actually crossed and went into East Asia. Like when we think of Buddhism, we think of, we don't think of India necessarily, even though that's its originating place. We definitely don't think of Afghanistan. We think of places like Thailand and Japan and Korea. That's in the past. Now they're Christian, but in the past, Korea. Not China. They're not Buddhist. Stop. It's time to learn these things. These are important details. Like when you're insulting Chinese, you need to know how to insult them properly. Oh, you didn't mean to insult them. See, that's the problem. Just learn to hate correctly. Just get some facts straight so that when you hate, you can hate properly. You know what I mean? So, the Taliban end up taking over, but not quite completely. The civil war still isn't done in 2001. They're still fighting a combined force called the Northern Alliance. The Northern Alliance is funded and aided and helped by the Islamic Republic of Iran, our arch enemy. We actually go to the Islamic Republic of Iran and we go, hey, we have a common enemy, the Taliban. We're going to take them out. You've been trying to take them out for years now. Let's work together. And the Islamic Republic of Iran had just been having negotiations with the Clinton administration to smooth over relations. In fact, the Islamic Republic had apologized in the last few years of the Clinton administration for the Iran hostage crisis. They come out and said, we're sorry, we regret it. It was a mistake. We only finally just apologized for overthrowing Mossadegh. Obama did it. So Clinton didn't even come back and go, yeah, we screwed up too. None of that. Iran did it unilaterally. And they were thinking, when Junior took over, Junior just never talked to the Iranians. But now it's almost a year later because 9/11's happened and we want to invade Afghanistan. Suddenly we're talking to the Iranians. The Iranians are like, yeah, let's keep talking. We can be friends. This will be good for our country. It'll be good for your country. Let's get rid of this problem that we have between us. Enemy of an enemy is a friend. You hate the Taliban, we hate the Taliban. Let's work together.
Speaking of 9/11, I know this question's about 5 minutes past. But when you said 9/11, the people who actually ordered the attack, they were located in Afghanistan, but the highest percentage of them, for the most part, were Saudi Arabian, correct?
Yeah.
So we didn't choose to go after Saudi Arabia.
No, we were going after
chose to go
Afghanistan.
off where they were located.
Right. Well, but either way, it's wrong, right? You can't attack Saudi Arabia. They didn't do it. You can't attack Afghanistan. They didn't do it, right? It's just wrong. Since when is collective punishment okay? It doesn't make any sense. This is illegitimate behavior as far as international. You can't attack a whole country just because a handful of people do something. If the state does it, if the Saudi state had come out and attacked us, then yeah, it's a legitimate beef. We can go. But this isn't state-sponsored. This is just this random thing, this random force. It's like when there's a school shooting. So now, what should we go bomb the neighborhood the kid is from that did the school shooting? Right? I mean, I don't understand. Should we kill their parents and maybe their brothers and sisters? I mean, I get that makes more sense than attacking a whole country just because a handful of people attacked us, because at least you're getting rid of their bad DNA that produces a little shithead kid with the assault rifle, and or the bad culture. I don't care, whichever it is. Doesn't matter, right? Is it nature, nurture? Let's kill them and just not worry about that.
Does Congress have to agree with these?
Technically, yes, because in the Constitution that we don't follow, it says that the right to have a war is in Congress, right? Congress has the right to declare war, but we have the War Powers Act. We don't do that anymore. We give the president 90 days to do whatever he wants to do with the military, and then Congress can come in. And no Congress, once we're at war, no Congress is going to come back and go, yeah, that's bad, because then they'll be unpatriotic and they'll get voted out, right? So, because you have to support the troops, no matter what happens, my country, right or wrong. Don't love it, get out, right? All the patriotic nonsense you guys hear or spew yourselves. It's just like, oh, stop. Use your brain. You have one, and it's not as small as a dinosaur's brain. It's bigger, so use it. So anyway, we go to the Iranians and we go, hey, let's work together. And the Iranians go, yeah, we got the Northern Alliance. We hook up. They basically hand us the Northern Alliance. We decide we're going to do an air war. We're going to send in elite troops and then use the Northern Alliance to sweep the country. And we work together with Iran, and the Taliban government is destroyed. We capture huge chunks of Afghanistan within just a few months. And then comes George Bush Jr.'s first State of the Union address in January of 2002. He gets up, TV, and he goes, there is an axis of evil. And it runs through, apparently he never looked at a map when he came up with this, North Korea, Iran, and Iraq. And Iran goes, wait, what? What? We just worked with you so you could take out the Taliban in Afghanistan, and now we're part of your axis of evil? The president of Iran at the time was a guy named Khatami. Khatami was hope. He was a reformer who was transitioning Iran in the direction that pretty much most people would agree is the right one. I'm sure there's somebody out there who doesn't like what he was doing. They were the hardliners in Iran, in fact. But most people in the world were thrilled with Khatami. He was so sweet. And he is the guy who backed supporting the US in Afghanistan. When Iran gets called part of the axis of evil, the hardliners then use that to say, look, that dumbass, he worked with the United States, and they basically take him out. And it's effectively the end of Iran's best hope for reform. And then the Iranians turn around and elect Ahmadinejad in the next election. They elect their Bush. Right? Stupid and cruel. That guy. I swear they found the same guy, even with the weird monkey eyes. Have you ever noticed Junior kind of had that weird monkey eye thing going? Well, so did Ahmadinejad. It was like really weird. Like I'm pretty sure they share a common grandparent somewhere. Did you have a question?
Do we have to prove and have evidence of why we chose that to deem evil?
Apparently not. No, there's no court. I mean, right, there is a world court. Okay, so there is a world court. We actually helped found it. It's part of the UN. There's actually two now. There's the criminal court in The Hague, and then there's the world court. And we've not signed on to the criminal one. We won't be a part of it. United States, People's Republic of China, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, basically the war criminal countries won't sign it. But the UN-based one, we are a part of, and we in 1980, I can't remember the year. I wanted to say 84, but don't quote me on that, even though it's being filmed. So we mined the harbors in Nicaragua. That's kind of an act of war, right? If I put bombs in your harbors so that when the ships pull in, they explode and sink, I'm pretty sure that's an act of war. Nicaragua took us to the World Court because some of their ships had sunk, and they took us to the World Court. And the World Court found for Nicaragua. You know what the Reagan administration did? We don't have to pay attention to it. Walked away from it. So when proof is part of the issue, we just ignore the ruling. Of course, that was the end of the World Court, because now anytime there's a ruling against a country in the World Court, they just go, well, the United States ignored it, we can too. Right? We might as well just disband it and start over with a new institution. So anyway, proof doesn't matter. So now, we go into Afghanistan, we don't really secure it. Just for the record, we do a really bang-up job of not doing much of anything. We capture Kabul, we capture a few of the major cities, we capture the airports that go with it, and then we let the Northern Alliance sweep the rest of the country, and we create a really unstable situation because the Northern Alliance, they're a bunch of warlords, and each warlord kind of carves out his own piece, and then they rule like nobles, like in a noble fiefdom. We established a noble fiefdom in Afghanistan as opposed to establishing a state with a state apparatus. We actually got rid of the state. It was the Taliban state. We get rid of that and replace it with a noble fiefdom. And of course, that's going to turn to hell in a handbasket. But before it does, it's actually quite calm for the first few years. Before it does, Junior immediately starts talking about Iraq. And I was like, whoa, there it is. 2002, Iraq, especially after Labor Day. Because every good advertiser knows if you're going to start an ad campaign, you start it right after Labor Day. And after Labor Day in 2002, Junior just keeps going on about Iraq this, Iraq that, Iraq this. And they would always do this. They would go, Iraq and al-Qaeda, Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden, in the same sentence. So that you keep associating the two together. Iraq, there wasn't a single hijacker on 9/11 who was from Iraq. Al-Qaeda actually Osama bin Laden actually put a price on Saddam Hussein's head. I think it was $10 million. If you could kill Saddam Hussein, that's not an act of friendship. That's, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, maybe $10, and it could be like a joke. You could have a little, if you kill so-and-so, I'll give you $10. Odds are nobody will actually try to collect, and it'll be funny. But 10 million, somebody's going to try and collect on that, because that's a lot of money. Anyway, so they're probably not friends. There's zero evidence they ever worked together because they hate each other's guts. So Colin Powell gets up in front of the UN, and he's got all these graphics and all these charts and all these pictures. And he goes, we know for a fact al-Qaeda is operating in Iraq. You know how we knew? Because the CIA was working with al-Qaeda, our enemy, in Iraq, because an enemy of an enemy is a friend. We're actually there working with the guys who just did 9/11 because we hate Saddam Hussein so much. Now, on top of that, he's got these pictures of trucks, and he goes, these are mobile chemical weapon manufacturing trucks, and they're trying to make biological weapons in these things too, and he brings in a vial of anthrax. It's not, it's probably just like flour. And he goes, this much anthrax would kill, I don't remember. And he like scares the crap out of everybody with all this nonsense talk. And then it turns out, you know what those mobile vehicles were? They were a form of chemical weapon. They were like the equivalent of our, you know, our the taco truck that pulls up at the construction site and does tacos and tamales, and then, you know, there's a lot of methane released, if you know what I mean. There were sandwich trucks and beans. They were doing full mudammas and stuff. You know, like, yes, you will produce chemicals. It's just they're not particularly deadly, even if they are flammable. Colin Powell later on admits that, first of all, he says two things. One, he will never run for office because he never wants to soil himself again with that kind of politics that's required to be in an office. And the other thing he said is that was the most embarrassing and disgraceful episode in his entire career, when he got up in front of the UN and talked about nothing and claimed it was really dangerous. He probably even had an inkling that that's what he was doing. He probably knew in his heart that the Bush administration was lying. Here they would do really fun tricks. Dick Cheney's office would release a memo to the New York Times saying there is categorical evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. There's no doubt they exist. It is certain. So then the New York Times would say, anonymous leak from White House says there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It's categorical. It's 100%. Next day, New York Times would go to Dick Cheney's office. They would interview Dick Cheney. And they would go, how do you know there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? I read it in the New York Times yesterday. And they would do loop-de-loops like this. The New York Times eventually put out an apology. Page 6, I think. They said, we deeply regret the role that we played knowingly in the build-up to the Iraq war, because we were duped, but we were also playing the game. In any case, we go back into war in 2003, and you kind of know a little bit of that story, right? We go in. Now, there are some really important questions that need to be asked. First of all, what are we going to do once we're in? Right? Never asked. That we just go in. We were so convinced with our own lying propaganda that we thought we would go in and that we'd just get hugs and kisses basically all day long. And we go in, and the first thing we do is we disassemble the Iraqi government. We then create Paul Bremer. If you watch the Frontline thing, Junior calls him Jerry Bremer. He doesn't even know the name of the guy he's sending to take over. But he says it, and then he goes like this, and then he's just like, whatever, I don't remember his name. It's like when Katrina happened, the guy in charge of FEMA was Brown, and he called him Brownie. You know, it's like, oh, yeah, I'm sending Brownie to New Orleans. It's like, do you hear how that sounds? I'm sending Brownie to New Orleans. It's like, just wrong at every level. Oh my God, learn to censor yourself. But anyway, so he's like, Paul Bremer goes in, he takes over, because we just eliminate the Iraqi government, and then Paul Bremer decides unilaterally that he's going to get rid of the Ba'ath Party. He's going to de-Baathification is what they call it. And the really amazing thing about this is they disassemble the state apparatus. There's a state, it runs things. They take that apart. Guess what? Now there's nothing to run things. There's no police, there's no bureaucracy, there's nobody running the electricity, there's no one running the food distribution, there's nobody running the sewers, because they simply disassemble the government. And then they don't replace it, because they can't, because we don't have the ability to create a government out of thin air. We don't know who to go to, first of all. We don't know who to hire. We don't have names of people with college degrees. We don't know what we're doing. It's like a crazy, it's a barrel full of monkeys, only they have really destructive weapons, and they're like smacking the crap out of each other. And all these low IQ people who don't know anything about the Middle East. Paul Bremer's entire Middle East education happened 2 weeks before he went to Iraq. They gave him a 2-week crash course on Middle East politics. I'm sure he was a freaking amazing expert. For us, when we're training somebody in linguistics so that they can go to the Middle East, 5 years of training isn't enough. And here's this guy with 2 weeks who's suddenly now running Iraq like a feudal lord. Like George Bush Jr. is like, you're the Duke of Iraq now. And Bremer goes and he implements this policy, de-Baathification, disassembles the government, and then, as if that's not catastrophic enough, does the army. They disassemble the Iraqi army. All of a sudden there's hundreds of thousands of Iraqi soldiers still armed without jobs who go home. Like, that's not going to turn out badly. And in the midst of all of this, looting breaks out because the Iraqis don't have a civil authority anymore. There's no way to prevent looting. And it's like the first day Paul Bremer's in office as the new overlord of Iraq, looting breaks out. And the only place we stuck anybody in front of, we stuck Marines in front of the Ministry of Oil. The Ministry of Antiquities was right next door and had a museum filled with all the Ottoman Empire's documents and filled with antiquities that went back 5,500 years. Not a single Marine in front of it. And it got looted. And the Ottoman Empire documents, these 200-year-old plus, some of them way older, 500-year-old documents just strewn in the streets. These are historical documents that just in the streets blowing in the wind. Antiquities, 5,000-year-old antiquities just vanish, disappear. And we're standing there in front of the Ministry of Oil, protecting it. And despite that, we still managed to lose oil. I don't know what the final sum was. I know last time I heard we were about $60 billion of oil disappeared. I think it ended up somewhere around $200 billion worth of oil disappeared. How do you lose that much oil? It's a lot of oil. Like, there's going to be a big black puddle somewhere. Really big. You should be able to find it if you just sort of open your eyes or use satellite imagery or something. Of course, we didn't lose any of it. It was our corrupt government, U.S. corrupt government, plundering that oil and taking it, handing it over to Halliburton and Exxon and all the other corrupt corporations that were participating in this war that was no different than when Germany invaded Poland in 1939. Right? Iraq never attacked us, never had the means to attack us, never threatened to attack us. So there's no basis for us to legitimately attack them. Now, the Bush administration claimed that Iraq was working on weapons of mass destruction and that might have the potential some point down the road to attack us. But they didn't at that moment have that. And the only reason they would have ever contemplated hurting us was because of the brutal sanctions that we had put in place. You know what I mean? Like, they might have been thinking about it, vengeance. They didn't have the capability for it, but they might have been thinking about it, but only because of the brutal sanctions put in place. Now, the CIA did come out and say that Saddam Hussein tried to kill George Bush Sr. and they had fouled the plot. So there was always this speculation, did Jr. just want to avenge his dad's? Well, a few years ago, the CIA came out and admitted no such thing ever happened. So that was even a lie. Like, even that was a lie. There was just nothing true about any of it. The whole thing is one lie stacked on top of the other. The aftermath, of course, is we have in Iraq where 5% of its parliament is made up of women. It was 34, now it's 5. Iraq is still ruled by a dictator. The new dictator is Nouri al-Maliki. Nouri al-Maliki, the day after the last US troop withdrew from Iraq, the day after, put out an arrest warrant for the vice president of Iraq, a Sunni, and has actually then systematically been going after the Sunnis. So Saddam Hussein, who wasn't particularly nice to the Shia and was a tyrant, has been replaced by Nouri al-Maliki, who is a tyrant who's particularly brutal to the Sunnis. In other words, all we've done is we've switched who's the victim as opposed to converting, right? He's just the Shia Saddam Hussein. This government is incompetent and it's corrupt. It's so corrupt the UN has declared that Iraq may be the most corrupt state on earth. So that we replace this tyranny with corruption and tyranny.
What happened to Paul?
Paul Bremer, he only served for 1 year. He was replaced because the Bush administration decided they needed the Iraqis to take over. Because the Bush administration, when we invaded Iraq, declared we were going to withdraw by like November. And then they had the mission accomplished banner and the president flying an airplane. And remember, and the war is over, we won. And the next thing you know, like, boom! And we're in a war because we're not very smart, right? This is why you should actually pay attention to IQ when you vote. Yours and the candidate you're voting for. You just really, it's time. Well, I actually think we should let the whole world vote for our president. First of all, they're probably smarter. But then second, that guy is kind of like the president of the world because, you know, he points in a direction and that country gets bombed. You would think we would let other people have a say in this. It just seems right thing to do. Anyway, Paul Bremer lasted about a year. He was replaced by Alawi. And then that guy lasted about a year and he was replaced, I can't remember the second guy, and then it wasn't Jafari. Jafari is the president. I don't remember. Anyway, and then Nouri al-Maliki, the current tyrant, replaced the second guy. So an American and then followed by 3 Iraqis. So that's kind of good. The last election, I shouldn't say the last. There's one election that's out still. They haven't formed a government yet. The one before that, the election, I guess it was 4 years ago, was great because it broke the record on the longest time after election before a government was formed. I think it was about a year. So they had the election and it took them a year to form the government. And the reason is the current dictator got second place. And the US government really wanted him to win. It's the Obama administration. The Obama administration really wanted him to win. He immediately flew to Saudi Arabia. When Saddam Hussein was president of Iraq, he lived in Saudi Arabia and Syria. Iran and Syria. Iran and Syria have always been really good allies, and so he was effectively an agent of the Iranians. So when we put him and made him president, he immediately then made Iraq an ally of Iran, and Syria our enemies. So the guy we installed has actually turned Iraq into an ally of our enemies. Because this is how incompetent. We can't even do nasty politics in a competent way. We can't even like go into a country and make it an ally. We actually turn it into an enemy. This is not okay, like at any level. So we kill millions of people, we smash a place to oblivion, and we don't even extract anything positive out of it. Even selfishly positive for our own purposes. That's how incompetent and corrupt we are. We are utterly corrupt too in Iraq. The stories are amazing. My favorite one is the chicken factory. So this is going to surprise you since Iraq is the founder of Western civilization, right? Egypt and Iraq co-founded Western civilization about 6,000 years ago. The exact date kind of fluctuates. It's between 6 and 6,500. Iraq did writing first about 5,300 years ago, but before that even, the first countries to ever have a government were Iraq and Egypt. And so, we're talking about a 6,000-year-old civilization. They figured out things like how to eat chicken and how to get chicken. They figured that out. I know, it seems weird. You wouldn't believe it, but they have that one. That one you got to figure they have down. So what do? We show up and we go, you're doing it wrong. You're just doing it wrong. You need a chicken factory. You need to take chickens and then put them through a machine, and they get cut up into pieces as they go through the machine, and then they end up in a saran wrap, styrofoam tray with plastic and a little, So we build them one. Multi-million-dollar facility, we build them one. They get it done, and of course, nobody's buying that chicken. So somebody comes, some high-ranked official comes to see this new facility. It's like some kind of international observation team to show what America is doing for these guys. The factory's never been turned on to run it. So the guy the administrator, the American administrator for this factory that serves zero purpose, that's cost the American taxpayer millions and they killed millions of Iraqis to get this thing built, right? That guy, the American in charge, goes running over to a nearby sheikh, and he says, I got a problem. I don't even have chickens, let alone have turned this thing on. What can I do? And the guy goes, don't worry about it. He goes and he buys the guy a bunch of chickens. They bring them to the factory, and they're live, so they kill them right there so that the people can see the process, and then they dump them into the conveyor belt, and they're going through, and the knives are, and then next thing you know, there's this saran wrap, foam wrapped chicken that just, and they're like, oh, and photo. So now they're done with that. So then they go to a dining room table, and they're going to eat the chicken. Only they can't, because it's the first time the chicken went through the machine. So the chicken are actually kind of cleaning the machine for the first time ever. You know what I mean? So they can't touch that chicken's all contaminated. So what they did was they had that same sheikh. He had actually gone and had his family, his wife or wives or whatever, or daughters or something. Somebody went and they killed some chickens, chopped them up and cooked them, and then set them on the table so that these guys could. But they're not chickens that actually went through the thing, but they're going to pretend. And then they eat their dinner and then more photos and everything's great. And then periodically, whenever they would have these politicians come through, U.S. politicians or foreign dignitaries, they would go get the sheikh, they'd buy some chickens, run them through the machine, throw that away, and then they would have the...
Because the chickens weren't wet?
So the machine had grease and snot and sweat and dirt in it because they never used it. And because they're not using it, over time cobwebs and rats and who knows, right? You know. So every time they would run the chickens through every 6 months, they can't eat that because they don't know what the chicken has been exposed to. So then they just prepare the chicken on the side that they've slaughtered in the old 6,000-year-old way.
Why don't they just clean it in the machine?
They don't use it. What would be the point in cleaning it?
They use it like once every 6 months.
Oh yeah, but then they would have to clean it once every 6 months before the inspection came. No, what's the point?
When did they find out it was a sham?
You know, I actually heard that particular story on NPR's, I'm trying to remember the name, it's the Terry Gross show, Fresh Air. Oh, so good. And she brought in this guy who's in deep doo-doo with the US government because he just tells one of these stories after the other. And he just exposes every ugly thing we were doing in Iraq. And it's just one corrupt disaster after the other. I can't remember the guy's name, but I'm sure if you did Fresh Air and looked up, like Iraq chicken factory disaster, I'm sure you could find it on Google. Anyway, it's just great stuff. I'm out of time, but I want to give you a chance to ask questions. But let me just say one more thing, and then I'll give you a chance to ask questions, and I'll let you go. So 2 questions, and I'll let you go. Iraq is in such miserable shape now. So now we won, and we left. We left 3 years ago. Iraq is in such miserable shape that somewhere over the last 4 or 5 weeks, somewhere between 800 and 2,000 men. That's the ISIS guys. There's somewhere between 800 and 2,000 men took out somewhere between 2 to 4 Iraqi divisions, somewhere between 30 to 60,000 men. So if you use the small numbers, 800 men took out 30,000 men and overran all of northern Iraq to the point where they've got Baghdad surrounded. They're moving on the Jordanian border, and then they came from Syria. They invaded Iraq. They've re-invaded Syria, and they've actually just captured Syria's oil-rich region. So they've got tanks, armored personnel carriers, they've got rockets, and they've got oil to fund all of this. And this is because we took a stable state under Saddam Hussein and smashed it and got rid of it. And then we left a power vacuum. Somebody's going to fill that power vacuum. The amazing thing is it's about the worst thing you could imagine filling that power vacuum. These ISIS guys are so nasty, al-Qaeda threw them out because they said, you're just too crazy, insane, inhumane. If you want, you can YouTube video these guys. They do mass executions. They make guys kneel down and they shoot them in the freaking head. You can see this. They film it and they post it on YouTube so you can see it. They've ordered all non-Sunnis living in Iraq, in the parts that they control, to leave. The Christians, they go put an N, they put a noon. They put a noon on their door saying, you better get out. You got a noon on your door. If you don't get out soon, we're going to come kill you. This is what we've created. This is our monster. Congratulations, Dr. Frankenstein. Anyway, okay, questions? Yes?
There's a rumor that Bush administration did it for Bush's personal interest in oil industry. Is that true?
There's no doubt that there's an oil industry piece to this. Iraq is the first country on earth to switch over oil sales from the US dollar to the euro. They did it in 2002, 2003, they're smashed in the Stone Ages, right? So again, so there's no doubt that that's a factor. Now there's a bunch of countries that do all their oil transactions in euros: Russia, Iran, Venezuela. So it sort of didn't work. Trying to scare countries into keeping the dollar as their means of transaction didn't work. By the way, what that means is every time there's an oil transaction, we get a share because you have to convert your currency into dollars, buy the oil, and then convert back into your currency. It's like it's our protection money. Like we're the mob. And you have to pay us a share of every transaction you make, or we'll bomb your country in the Stone Ages. So there's no doubt there's that. We did allow, when we captured Iraq, we did allow ExxonMobil and Halliburton basically unlimited access to Iraqi oil. Iraqi oil that Iraq had actually established contracts with like Russian companies and German companies. So we sort of screwed them up. Iraq has the second largest proven oil reserves on Earth. So all that's true, but it's very little of that oil comes to the United States. Before we attacked in '90, 5% of all the US oil came from Iraq and Kuwait combined. By the time we attacked in 2003, maybe Kuwait was 1 or 2%, and it was 0% from Iraq. So the reality was that this was not about US oil. The argument could be made that it was about European and Asian oil, because that oil in Iraq goes to India, China, and Europe. So whoever has got their army parked on top of those oil fields potentially could, should it come to it, cut off India, China, and Europe's oil. And so I think if the oil argument is true, there's no doubt that Halliburton and ExxonMobil made killer money off of this. But if it is true, it's probably more as an offensive measure against potential future rivals that backfired and failed because we couldn't stay. Right? Iraq won. Iraq won and now has lost. They beat us, but now they've got this new nightmare that's a direct result of this. So we didn't quite pull off what we intended. And the war has cost, in direct dollar amounts, $2 trillion. We maybe stole $200 billion. So if that was the deal, then we just lost $1.8 trillion net. That's a really bad business transaction. That's $2 trillion in direct. There's $1 trillion probably also floating out there because there are all the effects that we haven't paid yet, like the veterans effects, like the PTSD and then the hospitalization. But then there's also the drag on the economy. Wars are never good for economies, but this war was particularly bad for the entire global economy. So it's one of the reasons we had this depression that we're in. That was one of the triggers. So the reality, it's not just the financial, it's not just the housing. The war in Iraq was also part of it. So we probably lost $3 trillion on this. Like, this was a bad business transaction. Of course, the guy you elected bankrupted 2 companies and then almost bankrupted the Texas Rangers. Maybe you should have looked into that before you didn't vote for him, since he actually didn't even win, it turns out.
That time the CIA agents sided with al-Qaeda against the Iraqis. Remember that?
You mean when I was talking about Colin Powell talking about al-Qaeda operating in Iraq?
No, you said there was a CIA agent who was working with al-Qaeda.
The CIA was working with al-Qaeda in Iraq after 9/11.
Right.
Yes.
Why did the CIA side with al-Qaeda, and then with Iraq, wasn't al-Qaeda a bigger enemy?
No, because the Bush administration always had their crosshairs on Iraq.
Right.
They never really cared about Afghanistan. There was a reason to care about Afghanistan, and it was to put a gas pipeline through it. The company that was in charge of putting the gas pipeline through Afghanistan renewed their attempt to do it on September 12, 2001. But then they quickly abandoned it because it became really amazingly clear Afghanistan was never going to leave your gas pipeline intact. You could build it maybe, but it was not going to last 2 days before it was blown to smithereens. So that became a joke. So pretty fast, the Bush administration got obsessed with Iraq, and I think they just didn't care. Like, I don't think there was any morality in this whatsoever. I mean, the first order Paul Bremer gave, even before he did de-Baathification, was that the looters should be shot on sight. It's not probably a good start to the occupation. You know what I mean? And the military refused. And that Paul Bremer was shocked. He's like, wait a minute, I'm in charge. I'm the overlord. George Bush made me king of Iraq. You have to listen to me. And the military was like, no, we're not going to go shoot looters. Screw you. And they just refused. They ignored his order, which was like a moment of like, oh, cool. There's some hope. But there wasn't. It was... But then right away, right, the top brass in the U.S. military almost all resigned. They said, we're done. We're not going to participate in the Iraq War, and we're just leaving. And so you ended up with, eventually Petraeus. But that wasn't the original group that went in. Anyway, yes?
Okay, so like 2 of them are like yes or no's, and then the other one is something I just want to know. So I'm still in kind of like disbelief about like that we were friends at one point with Saddam Hussein.
Oh, yeah.
So that, I mean...
yeah.
Yes.
You can be in denial all you want, but boom, it's
okay.
there.
Yeah, I never, okay. Cool,
yeah.
Cool. The second is that there's a big difference between the Taliban and al-Qaeda.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they're not totally different. They're both Islamists. They both want to create a fundamentalist state. The Taliban are indigenous to Afghanistan. They're made up mostly of Pashtuns from Afghanistan. It's kind of an ethnic line. Al-Qaeda is mostly made up of Arabs. It means the general, Qaid. What happened was, in the war against Afghanistan's war against the Soviets, Osama bin Laden. Oh, I just did a Bush administration thing. Osama bin Laden said, I want to get a bunch of volunteers together to go fight the Soviets and fight communism and free Afghanistan. And he recruited, using his own money, he recruited all these warriors, mostly from the Arab world, but there were Somalis and there were Indonesians and Filipinos. And they went into Afghanistan and they fought the Soviets. And we loved them. We supplied them with weapons and training. And we had this connection with his dad that was on a personal level. And then after the war ended, the Afghans, the Taliban and al-Qaeda, even though al-Qaeda isn't Afghan, but they all felt betrayed by us because we never helped them.
So who did we attack? Who were we fighting for years?
Everybody. We basically just went, hey, yeah, you were all friends, but not any longer, and we go to war with everybody.
Okay, and the last question was, you said that uranium had a half-life of 4.6 billion years or something like that. So uranium is a natural element, or is it like, so how is it not always radiating, and where is it coming from?
It's always radiating. There are uranium deposits around the earth. There's a great one in underneath the Navajo reservation. It's one of the reasons why the Navajos don't have casinos, because they don't need to. They just sell the U.S. government uranium. It's actually how we know the age of the earth. There's half the amount of uranium that we would predict to be on an Earth-like planet. So if there's half, it means the Earth is 4.6 billion years old.
And so is that just radioactive just to be around or pick up, or is it just you have to weaponize it in order to make it?
No, it does not have to be weaponized to be radioactive. It is fully radioactive without it being weaponized.
Like, the people living in that Indian reservation get bad effects?
No, but the guys who mine it, I actually know he's dead now, but the guys who mine it get cancer. I knew a guy who had leukemia because he was a uranium miner. I was actually his daughter's high school teacher, and that's how I got to know him. And his life was terminated, but he was still walking around. He just knew he had a few years left. And I was like, why did you do it? He goes, the money was good. The benefits, I hope they were good too. What kind of health care do you have? I'm going to die, it doesn't matter. I was like,
do you want to explain depleted uranium?
Okay, so depleted uranium is the term that's used all the time. So there's uranium-238 and uranium-235. 238 is what you want for weapons grade, and 238 is what occurs in the highest frequency in nature. So what happens is when you get uranium, you actually take some of the 238 out and leave as much of the 235 as you can. That increases the ratio of 235 to 238, and that's what turns it into weapons grade. But now you got all this really dense metal. Uranium is extremely dense. So you've got this really dense metal. It turns out dense metals moving at high velocities act really explosive. You don't even need to put an explosive charge. You can just launch uranium-238 like a ball, and it will explode. And it actually vaporizes. It actually aerosolizes, and you can breathe it right into your lungs. It's really great stuff. I highly recommend it. And it's one of the reasons why we decided never to use them in a combat situation where we put our troops on the ground, which we then did in 1991 and then again in 2003. And then we wonder why we have all these sick soldiers who have immune system issues and reproductive issues. Well, it turns out one of the symptoms of radiation poisoning is immune system issues and reproduction issues. So that's almost certainly what happened to those soldiers. And of course, all of southern Iraq is having those problems. So it's not really depleted in any sense of the word. So how dangerous is it? We use depleted uranium as ballast in airplanes. So, like it's around you in somewhat common day use stuff like airplane. The guys that had it at Los Alamos when they were making the nuclear bomb in the Manhattan Project, they got a ball of it from Berkeley, and they took it out to look at it, and they dropped it, and it landed on the ground, and that drop was enough to cause a brief reaction, and it dumped a bunch of radiation in the room and killed one of the scientists. So it's not great stuff to have. In the tanks where you have depleted uranium shells, it's in this fluorescent green fluid, and then to pull them out, you can't just handle these things. You have to wear a special mitt, and then you can load the round. I'm guessing that's still not okay. I'm guessing that's still a mess.
Which one is yellow cake?
Yellow cake, that was what Saddam Hussein was accused of trying to get a hold of to make a nuclear bomb, and it turns out it's not true. It was just a low-grade uranium ore that they were that supposedly he was trying to get from Niger. You can get yellow cake in Niger. And the guy that went to go find it came back and said, no, it's not true. Saddam Hussein isn't trying to get yellow cake. Stop talking about it. His wife was a CIA operative in the field. Dick Cheney's office outed her and almost got her killed. And they had to extract her because she was publicly outed as a CIA operative. And by the way, just for fun, the George Bush Senior administration got a law through Congress saying that if anybody ever revealed the identity of a CIA operative in the field, it was an act of treason punishable by death. So if you're with me, I think there's a death penalty case for Dick Cheney and his friends like Scooter Libby. We actually had a guy whose name was Scooter in the government, right? Really? One more thing about Dick Cheney. There's an arrest warrant out for him in Vermont. So he can't go to Vermont. There's also an arrest warrant for him and Condoleezza Rice in Spain. So they can't travel to Spain, and they can't travel to any country that Spain has an extradition treaty with, which is about 80% of the world. So because potentially Spain could go, they landed in your airport, you got to get them. Now, that could cause an international incident, so it probably wouldn't happen. But so there are people that are mad enough. I love that Vermont is doing this. Anyway, all right. Any more questions, or am I done? All right, I'm done.